The morning air outside the glass tower was cool and sharp, but inside the building everything moved fast and warm, like a machine that never slept. Assistants hurried across the marble floor with tablets in their hands. Phones rang nonstop. Screens flashed numbers, charts, and global headlines. At the center of it all was the woman everyone watched carefully, the CEO. She had built the company into one of the most powerful technology firms in the world. People admired her discipline, her intelligence, and her ability to close deals that others thought were impossible. She walked with confidence, heels clicking in perfect rhythm, eyes always focused straight ahead. She didn't smile often, and when she did, it was usually controlled. That morning was important. Very important. By the end of the day, she was supposed to secure a $1 billion international partnership that could change the future of the company. Investors from different countries had flown in. Some were already in the city. Others were joining virtually. The pressure was high, but she looked calm. She liked pressure. She believed it proved who was strong and who was weak. Downstairs, near the private entrance, a black luxury car waited. The driver stood beside it, checking his watch. He was dressed neatly in a dark suit, simple but clean. His posture was straight, and his movements were quiet and careful. He had been hired a few weeks earlier through the company's executive transport service. He didn't talk much, but he always listened. He arrived early. He opened doors gently. He never interrupted. When she stepped out of the building, he opened the back door for her. "Good morning," he said politely. She nodded without really looking at him. "We're already behind schedule," she replied, sliding into the seat and opening her tablet immediately. He closed the door and took his place behind the wheel. As he drove, he adjusted the mirror slightly, making sure the ride was smooth. Traffic was heavy, but he moved through it calmly. Inside the car, she was on a call with her executive team. "Yes, I've reviewed the numbers," she said firmly. "If they question the valuation, remind them of the expansion data from Southeast Asia, and make sure the translation system is fully tested. I don't want any delays." There was silence on the other end, then nervous agreement. The driver listened without showing it. When she ended the call, she let out a small sigh and looked out the window. After a few moments, he spoke carefully. "Excuse me," he said. "The lead investor from Shanghai, his last name is pronounced Zhao with a soft tone. Sometimes people say it too sharply." She looked up from her tablet slowly. "What?" she asked. "The pronunciation," he repeated gently. "It can make a difference in formal introductions." For a second, she stared at him through the rearview mirror. Then she gave a short laugh. "Don't worry," she said. "I think I can handle pronouncing a name." He nodded. "Of course." But she wasn't finished. "It's kind of you to be concerned," she added lightly, though her tone had a sharp edge. "But this is a high-level negotiation. Just focus on driving." The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was clear. He felt it. He understood it. He had felt that tone before in his life. Still, he simply said, "Yes, ma'am," and kept his eyes on the road. A few minutes later, she was rehearsing her opening speech quietly. When she reached one of the international greetings, she paused and mispronounced a French phrase. The driver heard it. He hesitated. Then, very respectfully, he said, "If I may." The phrase is pronounced a little differently. This time she laughed more openly. "You speak French now?" she asked, amused. "I do," he replied calmly. She shook her head, smiling in disbelief. "What next? Mandarin too?" There was no arrogance in his voice when he answered. "Yes." She turned fully in her seat now, studying him for the first time. "You're serious?" "Yes." She stared at him for a few seconds, trying to decide if he was joking. He didn't smile. He didn't look nervous. He simply focused on the road. "Well," she said finally, leaning back. That's impressive. But her tone suggested she didn't quite believe him. After a moment, she added, "You know, it's good to have hobbies." He didn't respond. They arrived at the International Conference Center, a tall building with glass walls reflecting the morning sun. Security opened the gates quickly when they recognized the company logo on the car. Before she stepped out, she paused. "You can wait in the designated area," she said. "This might take several hours." "Yes, ma'am." As she walked inside, surrounded by assistants and advisors, he remained by the car for a moment. He looked up at the building. His expression didn't show anger or embarrassment. It showed something else. Patience. Inside the conference hall, everything was perfectly arranged. Long tables, microphones, flags representing different countries. Bottles of water placed with careful symmetry. Screens ready for presentations. The investors began arriving one by one. A Bay group from Germany spoke quietly among themselves. Two representatives from Japan reviewed printed documents. A delegate from Brazil smiled politely while checking his phone. Conversations blended together in different languages. The CEO greeted each guest confidently. However, during one introduction, she slightly mispronounced the name. The investor corrected her gently, still smiling. "It's all right," he said. "Many people find it difficult." She forced a polite laugh, but inside, she felt slightly irritated. As more guests gathered, she began noticing how often languages shifted around her. A sentence in Spanish, a response in Arabic, a side comment in Mandarin. She depended heavily on her translation system and remote language team. Everything was supposed to run smoothly. Technology was her strength. Meanwhile, outside, the driver sat quietly in the waiting area. He had brought a small notebook with him. Instead of scrolling through his phone like the other drivers, he read something carefully. Now and then, faint voices from inside the hall drifted out when the doors opened. He recognized phrases instantly. Technical terms, financial vocabulary, diplomatic expressions. He listened without trying to listen. Back inside, the CEO stood at the front of the room and began her opening remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen," she started confidently, "it is an honor to welcome you." Her speech flowed well in English. She even attempted short greetings in other languages. Some were correct. Some were slightly off. A few investors exchanged subtle glances. It wasn't a disaster. But it wasn't perfect either. During a short break before the detailed negotiation session began, she stepped aside to check messages on her phone. One of her senior advisors approached her quietly. "Everything seems fine so far," he said. "But they are very particular about communication. Cultural accuracy matters a lot to them." She nodded. "That's why we have translators." He hesitated. "Of course." She dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. Outside, the driver noticed the assistant from earlier walking past, looking stressed. "Is everything okay?" he asked politely. She sighed. "It's just, there's a lot of pressure. So many languages. So many details." He gave a small understanding nod. "It will work out." She gave him a tired smile and hurried back inside. As the main negotiation session prepared to begin, the CEO returned to her seat at the head of the table. The screens lit up. The international partners leaned forward. This was the moment. She glanced briefly toward the large glass doors at the back of the hall. Through the reflection, she could faintly see the waiting area outside. For a second, she remembered the driver's calm voice correcting her pronunciation. "You speak Mandarin too?" she had asked. "Yes." She shook off the memory. It didn't matter. This was her stage, her deal, her moment, and she believed she was fully prepared. But sometimes, the biggest lessons begin with small laughter. And sometimes, the person we overlook quietly holds more knowledge than we can imagine. The negotiation had not yet started. The real test was still coming. The room slowly settled into silence as everyone took their seats. The long table felt heavier now, not because of the documents placed on it, but because of the expectations in the air. Screens glowed softly on the walls. Assistants stepped back. Doors closed gently. The negotiation was about to begin. The CEO straightened her jacket and looked around the table. On her right sat the delegation from China. On her left, investors from Germany and France. Across from her were representatives from Brazil, Japan, and the Middle East. Each group had advisors, legal teams, and financial analysts beside them. This was not just a meeting. It was a test of trust. She began confidently, presenting slides that showed growth charts, expansion maps, and projected profits. Her voice was steady and clear. For the first 20 minutes, everything went smoothly. The investors listened carefully. Some nodded. Some took notes. Then the questions started. The lead investor from China leaned forward and spoke in Mandarin. His tone was calm but serious. The CEO glanced toward the large screen where the remote translation team was connected. There was a short pause. The translator's voice came through the speakers, slightly delayed. The sentence was translated into English, but it sounded awkward. A few key financial terms were not quite right. The CEO noticed it immediately. She answered confidently anyway, hoping the meaning was close enough. But when the translator repeated her answer back in Mandarin, the investor's expression changed. He looked confused. He replied again, this time speaking faster. The translator's voice cracked slightly. We are experiencing a small delay. Someone from the technical team whispered near the wall. The CEO kept her face calm, but her fingers tightened around her pen. The German representative then asked a detailed question in his native language. The translation came through again, but this time the numbers were incorrect. A decimal point was misplaced. It was a small mistake, but in a billion-dollar negotiation, small mistakes felt huge. Murmurs began around the table. The French delegate leaned toward his colleague and whispered something in French. The Japanese representative quietly spoke to his advisor in Japanese. The room slowly filled with overlapping conversations in different languages. The CEO raised her hand gently. "One moment, please," she said, forcing a polite smile. She looked toward the tech team. "Is the system stable?" A nervous technician adjusted his headset. "There seems to be a connection issue with the remote servers. We are trying to fix it." "How long?" she asked quietly. "We don't know." The investors were still speaking among themselves. Some looked patient. Others did not. The CEO felt something she rarely felt: uncertainty. She had prepared for financial risks, market competition, and legal complications. But she had not prepared for a complete breakdown in communication. The Chinese investor spoke again, this time addressing his German counterpart directly in English, but with strong accents and missing phrases. The German representative responded in basic English, trying to explain his concern about the revenue-sharing structure. But misunderstandings began building like invisible walls. One investor thought the company was reducing long-term returns. Another believed the expansion plan was limited to only 2 regions instead of 5. A third misunderstood a licensing clause entirely. The CEO could see it happening in front of her eyes. Trust was slipping, not because of bad intentions, but because of unclear language. She tried to step in. "Let me clarify," she said. But as she spoke, she realized she was now explaining explanations. The natural flow of conversation was gone. A simple sentence turned into a 5-minute correction. Outside the glass doors, the driver sat in the waiting area. The hallway was quiet, but every time the conference room doors opened slightly, fragments of conversation drifted out. He heard Mandarin. He heard German. He heard frustration. He closed his notebook slowly and listened more carefully. He wasn't trying to interfere, but years of studying languages had trained his ears to recognize tone, not just words. He could tell when a discussion was turning tense. Inside, the CEO felt the temperature in the room shift. It wasn't physical heat. It was pressure. The Brazilian investor spoke in Portuguese, asking about regulatory approvals in South America. The translator's connection cut out mid-sentence. Silence filled the room. The CEO's advisor leaned toward her and whispered, "This is not good." She forced herself to remain calm. "We will resolve this immediately," she said to the room, but she could see doubt appearing on faces. The Japanese delegate adjusted his glasses and spoke softly in Japanese to his team. Though she didn't understand the words, she understood the body language. They were reconsidering. The German representative folded his arms. The French delegate stopped taking notes. Every second of confusion felt like money slipping away. Near the hallway entrance, one of the assistants stepped outside briefly, holding her phone tightly. She looked stressed. The driver stood up gently. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She shook her head. The translation system crashed. The remote team can't reconnect. They're trying to restart it, but the investors are losing patience. He listened carefully. "How many languages are being spoken inside?" he asked calmly. She looked at him, surprised by the question. "Several. Mandarin, German, French, Japanese, Portuguese, Arabic, and English, of course." He paused for a moment. Then he said something simple. "If they need temporary assistance, I can help." She blinked. "Help? With translation?" She hesitated. She remembered the short exchange in the car earlier. She remembered him saying he spoke multiple languages, but this was different. This was a billion-dollar negotiation. "I don't know if that would be appropriate," she said uncertainly. "I understand," he replied gently. "But misunderstandings can be costly." Inside the room, voices were growing louder. Not angry, just confused. But confusion was dangerous in business. The assistant took a deep breath. "Wait here," she said. She slipped back into the conference room and approached the CEO quietly. "There might be another option," she whispered. The CEO looked at her sharply. "What?" "The driver. He says he speaks several of the languages being used." For a second, the CEO thought she misheard. "The driver?" She repeated, "Yes." The CEO almost laughed again, but she stopped herself. The room behind her was still filled with mixed conversations. "This is not the time for experiments," she said under her breath. "I know," the assistant replied softly. "But right now, we don't have a functioning system." Across the table, the Chinese investor raised his hand politely but firmly. "We need clarity," he said in English. "If communication is unstable, perhaps we should postpone." Postpone. The word hit hard. Postponing would signal weakness. It would raise doubts in the market. It could even push competitors to step in. The CEO's mind raced. Through the glass doors, she could see the faint outline of the waiting area. She remembered his calm voice correcting her pronunciation that morning. "You speak Mandarin too?" "Yes." She inhaled slowly. "This is temporary," she told herself. She looked at her assistant. "Bring him." The assistant nodded and quickly stepped outside. The driver stood up as she approached. "They would like you to come in," she said, still sounding unsure. He nodded once, buttoned his jacket properly, and walked toward the conference room. As the doors opened, several investors turned their heads. They were expecting a technician. Instead, they saw the company's driver enter the room. The CEO met his eyes for a brief second. There was no smile now, no laughter, just tension. He stopped near the doorway respectfully. "How may I assist?" he asked calmly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Chinese investor said something in Mandarin. Testing him. Without hesitation, the driver responded fluently. His tone professional and precise. The room fell silent. The German representative leaned forward and spoke in German. The driver answered smoothly. The French delegate tried next. Then the Japanese representative. Each time, the responses came naturally, without pause, without confusion. The CEO felt her heartbeat slow, not from fear now, but from shock. The investors looked at each other. Impressed, the driver turned gently toward the CEO. "If you would like," he said respectfully, "I can assist with real-time clarification until your system is restored." She stared at him for a brief second longer. Then she nodded. Double quotes. "Yes," she said quietly. "Please." And just like that, the balance in the room began to shift. The man she had laughed at that morning was now standing between success and failure. And everyone in the room was about to see who he really was. For a few seconds after he spoke, no one moved. The room felt different now. Just minutes earlier, there had been confusion, overlapping voices, and growing doubt. Now there was silence, curious, cautious silence. The driver stepped closer to the table, but did not sit down. He remained standing slightly behind the CEO's chair, giving her space, making it clear he was there to support, not to lead. The Chinese investor spoke first again, this time in Mandarin, his tone formal and direct. He asked about long-term market protection and intellectual property risks in Asia. His question was complex, filled with financial terminology and legal phrasing. The driver listened carefully without interrupting. When the investor finished, he translated into English smoothly, not word for word, but with clarity and structure. He's asking how the company plans to protect regional patents while expanding distribution rights to third-party partners. He explained. The CEO blinked slightly. That was not how the remote translator had framed the earlier question. This version was clearer, sharper. She answered confidently, outlining the legal safeguards and partnership structures already in place. When she finished, the driver turned back to the investor and translated her response into Mandarin, maintaining her confident tone but softening certain phrases to match cultural formality. He adjusted small expressions so they sounded respectful rather than aggressive. The investor's face relaxed. He nodded slowly. Next, the German representative leaned forward and spoke in German, referencing a specific financial projection in the slide deck. He questioned the risk ratio in year 3 and suggested it might be too optimistic. Again, the driver translated with calm precision. He believes the third-year forecast may not fully account for regulatory slowdowns in the European Union. He clarified. The CEO felt a small wave of relief. That concern made sense. It was specific. It was manageable. She responded with data, explaining contingency plans and reserve allocations. The driver translated again, this time adjusting technical phrasing into language that felt natural and credible. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. The German representative listened carefully. Then, to everyone's surprise, he smiled slightly. "Thank you," he said in English. It was a small word, but it carried weight. Around the table, posture began to shift. Shoulders relaxed. Pens started moving again. Investors leaned in rather than leaning back. The French delegate asked a question in French about branding strategy and consumer perception in North Africa. The driver responded immediately, translating into English while also adding a quiet note. He is concerned about cultural alignment in advertising imagery, he said gently. The CEO glanced at him for half a second. That extra insight hadn't been directly stated, but it was clearly implied. She adjusted her response accordingly, speaking about local partnerships and inclusive campaigns. The French delegate nodded in approval. Across the table, The Japanese representative spoke next. His tone was softer, more indirect. He asked about long-term commitment, but not in a direct way. Instead, he spoke about patience, stability, and shared vision. The driver listened closely, then translated carefully. He is asking whether this partnership is a short-term profit strategy or a generational collaboration, he explained. That interpretation changed everything. The CEO realized that if she had answered the literal words, she might have missed the deeper meaning. Instead, she shifted her tone. "This is not a quick expansion," she said slowly. "We are building something meant to last decades." The driver translated into Japanese. With equal care, the Japanese delegate bowed his head slightly. The energy in the room was transforming. Minutes earlier, the deal had been seconds away from collapse. Now, clarity was rebuilding trust. The Brazilian investor joined in, speaking rapidly in Portuguese about infrastructure investment in South America. The driver matched his speed, translating both ways without hesitation. At one point, the Brazilian delegate laughed at something the driver said in Portuguese. Several people looked surprised. "What did you say?" the CEO asked quietly. He replied respectfully. I reassured him that our shipping timelines consider seasonal port congestion. He appreciated that. The CEO felt something shift inside her. Not just relief, but awareness. This was not random knowledge. This was experience. The Middle Eastern representative spoke in Arabic next, raising concerns about licensing rights in emerging markets. The conversation became detailed and technical. Numbers were exchanged. Legal terms surfaced. The driver handled each one carefully. At one moment, the Arabic delegate paused and looked at him closely. "Where did you study?" he asked in Arabic. The driver translated the question into English for the CEO, then answered respectfully in Arabic before translating his own answer back. "I studied linguistics and international economics," he said calmly. Several heads turned. The CEO stared at him, processing the words. The German representative raised an eyebrow. "You have a background in economics?" "Yes," the driver replied simply. The room grew even quieter. For the first time, the CEO truly looked at him, not as an employee in a uniform, not as a driver waiting outside, but as a professional standing in a boardroom full of global investors. "How many languages do you speak?" the French delegate asked, curious. The driver answered without pride, without exaggeration. 9. A soft murmur moved around the table. The CEO felt her face grow warm, remembering her laughter in the car that morning. "You speak Mandarin too?" she had said, amused. "Yes." And he had meant it. The negotiation continued, but now it felt balanced. Questions were answered clearly. Concerns were addressed respectfully. Cultural differences were not obstacles anymore. They were bridges. At one point, two investors began speaking to each other directly in their own languages, debating a clause in the contract. The driver listened to both sides and then calmly summarized their positions in English so the CEO could respond strategically. He wasn't just translating words. He was translating meaning. Hours passed, but no one seemed restless anymore. The earlier tension had dissolved into focused discussion. The CEO found herself glancing at him occasionally, noticing details she had ignored before. His steady posture, his controlled breathing, the way he waited for speakers to finish before responding, the way he never interrupted her, always giving her authority, even when he clearly understood the conversation at a deep level. She began to realize something uncomfortable. He had been capable all along. She had simply never looked closely enough to see it. During a short break, several investors approached him directly, thanking him in their native languages. He responded politely each time. The Chinese investor smiled. "Your company is fortunate. he said in Mandarin. The driver translated it into English. The CEO felt the words land heavier than expected when everyone returned to their seats. The final discussion began. The valuation agreement. Numbers were projected onto the screen. Percentages were debated. Risk distribution was examined carefully. This was the critical point. If trust faltered now, the deal would fall apart. The German representative proposed a small adjustment to revenue sharing. The Japanese delegates suggested a longer contract term. The Brazilian investor requested infrastructure guarantees. Each request could have been misunderstood, but this time, clarity ruled. The driver translated not just sentences, but tone. He softened direct statements when needed. He sharpened vague ones when clarity mattered. He ensured no one felt dismissed. Finally, after one last round of discussion, the lead Chinese investor leaned back in his chair. He spoke in Mandarin. Slowly, the driver listened, then turned to the CEO. He says they are prepared to move forward, he translated. Room seemed to hold its breath. He believes the partnership reflects mutual respect and long-term commitment. Silence. Then the German representative nodded. So do we, he said, one by one. The other delegates agreed. The billion-dollar deal once slipping away was now within reach. Again, the CEO felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Gratitude. She looked at the driver standing beside her chair. For the first time that day, there was no distance in her eyes, only recognition. Man she had seen as just a driver had just protected the most important deal of her career. And the negotiation was not over yet, but the balance of power in the room had already changed forever.